Thanking you, Albert. That was your arrival. Thank you. We're very happy to host this panel on liberal democracy, liberal, radical, and socialist as part of the panels we've been doing on launching this year's Socialist Register on rethinking democracy. Over the last 10 volumes that we've been planning, they've been kind of linked. The first 5 were about the crisis that I did with Leo, was about the crisis and the events of the crisis, strategy in the crisis, how the economic crisis was also affecting class formation. We then turned to a second 5-year plan of volumes that was thinking about the current political setting. Obviously, in the middle of the crisis with the rise of the New Right, it became impossible not to begin with a volume trying to map the different forms that the right was taking across the advanced capitalist core countries in Europe, also in North America, and then a lot of other places around the world as well. We followed that up with a volume about revolution, rethinking revolution, in particular in light of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Its impacts, its meanings, the other forms of revolution through the 20th century, the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, and so many other themes. It was apparent when we were thinking that volume through and planning it, it became possible not to also be thinking about democracy. And this volume became a counterpart to that volume on rethinking revolution, on rethinking democracy. That's obviously the legacy and how we interpret 1917 are totally intertwined with the question of democracy. But it's also, of course, Marx and Engels are part of the class of 1848 and the democratic revolutions then. It's also the legacy and issues related to how we think about the First International, and all the other forms of challenges and attempts to deepen democracy through the 20th century. Since 1968, in particular, the legacy of the New Left has been attempting to think beyond the boundaries of liberal democracy and politics and rethink the institutions and practices of participatory democracy. We also started this millennium of trying to think through what 21st century socialism would be, with also democracy being an integral aspect of that. The developments over the last decade under neoliberalism, last 2 decades under neoliberalism, particularly the rise of an increasingly authoritarian neoliberalism, has also got all these terms that have become popular. False democracy, post-democracy, non-democracy, democracy without alternatives, and so on. So there's a huge set of issues related to how we think about democracy that have become integral to thinking about the politics of the left and remaking the politics of the left. In this volume, we attempted to span a number of key themes. Some of them were what we discussed this morning on the legacies of liberal democracy, and that has put us into the current conditions. Some are the questions about creating new capacities and new forms of democracy that emerge from the working class, whether it's workplace democracy, agrarian democracy, the experiments at the subnational level, such as in Kerala, a range of other attempts to form democracy, new forms of democracy. Another theme of this volume is about the modes, institutions, and social practices of democracy. A key aspect of that, which are an incredible set of essays dealing with media democracy and the question of the forms of the media and media practices today. Digital democracy, the problems of how the media has been covering elections, the legacy of one of the main public institutions of the media, the BBC, and so forth. Final theme in this volume is what we'll turn to in this panel, dealing with the theoretical foundations and radical conceptions of democracy, in particular then in relationship to socialist democracy. What are the premises and visions that will be required to rethink socialist democracy in the 21st century? We are very fortunate to have 3 eminent thinkers on these themes with us today to speak. Alex Demirovic is here from Germany. He's taught at many German universities, far more than he ever wanted to. He continues to teach at German universities. He also has been recently, although now leaving those relationships, to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin, where he held a number of research and other posts with the Institute. He's written numerous books in Germany, an incredible number of articles also in English on different aspects of political theory, most of them related to various themes of democracy. He has an essay in the current volume. We also have Nancy Holmstrom here with us, who's on the editorial board of the Socialist Register. She's recently retired from the philosophy department at Rutgers, well known for her work on Socialist Feminist Project and various writings on socialism and feminism, and also more recently has been writing and speaking a lot on issues related to ecology, and will speak on democracy and the ecological crisis. Finally, the co-editor for the Socialist Register, Leo Panitch, will speak about democratic socialism in the state today, partly from his writing across the years in the Socialist Register, and from an essay that's in this register, and also that this has been expanded into a new book called The Socialist Challenge Today. Both that book and this year's register are available at the monthly review bookstall downstairs. As well, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is passing around a sign-up sheet, and it's going around. We want you to sign in for attending. And they have a number of their numerous publications here that are free to pick up, but also with their table upstairs we'll have them. Enough of my introduction. We will now turn to Nancy to begin with, speaking particularly around democracy and the ecological crisis.
I'm not sure if my voice has the proper timbre and extent as Greg, so please just raise your hand if it's not okay. Let's do that from now on, okay? If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. Last fall, 15,000 scientists issued a second dire notice to humanity that we're on a collision course with the limits of our planet. They concluded, quote, "To prevent widespread misery, humanity must practice a more environmentally sustainable alternative to business as usual, including, quote, reassessing the role of an economy rooted in growth," unquote. That means we have to challenge capitalism. There is no capitalism without growth. Rosa Luxemburg's statement on the eve of World War I that the choice is between socialism or barbarism was never more true. But the choice now is between socialism and our very existence. This reality, I believe, should shape the way we think about politics and how we do politics. Now, democracy is often said to be both the means and the end of socialism. But capitalist societies are peculiar class societies in that, especially the United States, they're said to be democratic. So what do we mean by democracy and by socialism? The root meaning of the word democracy is ruled by the people, which entails that democracy admits of degrees according to two measures. The first is how inclusive is the category of the people. And second, what the people get to decide. By the first measure, which is usually the only one that's considered, our democracy in the US and Europe has clearly expanded. In those capitalist societies that are politically democratic, not all of course, as is often assumed, everyone, that is, or rather, at least all citizens, get to vote. But this hardly happened from the beginning, by nature, as supporters of capitalism seem to believe. Indeed, it's been a long, heroic struggle. At the beginning, only a tiny percentage of the population had the vote. Property qualifications for male voters were not removed in the U.S. until the middle of the 19th century, surprisingly not so long ago. And women only won the right to vote less than 100 years ago. African Americans were effectively denied the right to vote in the southern states until the Civil Rights Movement won the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they still face struggles over felon disenfranchisement and voter ID. Even at its most inclusive, however, the formal equality of democracy and capitalism is undermined by economic inequality. Those with more economic power simply have more influence over political decisions. The extremes of inequality, the influence of money in elections, and the peculiar institution of the Electoral College further limit U.S. political democracy. But more important, however, is the second measure of the degrees of democracy, namely that the range of issues on which voters have power is extremely limited. Both before and after capitalism, I'm talking about the Soviet-style systems, political and economic power were fused. With capitalism, however, the economic and the political became separate for the first time, and real social power rests in the economy. As Ellen Wood argued, this made political democracy both more possible, but also less important. The most crucial decisions affecting us all, what to produce, for example, gas guzzling and driverless private cars or buses and trains, how to produce them, fossil fuels or renewables, and the all-important question of how much to produce are not up for a vote. They're not made the majority of citizens, but by capitalists who are unelected. A full-scale economic democracy, a broader democracy, is simply incompatible with capitalism. Small countries, more subject to global capitalist powers, have even less ability to govern themselves. Pushed to austerity and anti-ecological decisions, democratically elected governments are fragile as people get frustrated and can turn to authoritarian leaders. European countries are now in pretty much the same situation through the domination of the European Union. Aristotle defined democracy very clearly as an institution in which, quote, the freeborn and poor control the government, being at the same time a majority, unquote. Whereas, he said, in an oligarchy, quote, the rich and better born control the government, being at the same time a minority, unquote. By these definitions, clearly we live in an oligarchy, not a democracy, despite the vote. And how could it be otherwise, given the extremes of inequality? Noam Chomsky has a very apt acronym to describe our system of political democratic institutions within an oligarchy. He called them RECs, R-E-C-B-S, really existing capitalist democracies. Despite these criticisms, however, I think it's very important not to reject totally the limited institutions of political democracy we have, or to disparage the concept of democracy, as too many on the left are wont to do. That we can meet here and make these critiques, publish them, and organize to change things is crucial. The absence of these democratic controls in China, on China's development, is one of the chief contributors to the ecological disaster their development is creating. In our RECs, we can not only talk, but organize around concrete issues that challenge vested interests, like fossil fuel corporations. Sometimes we even win, as did the struggle to ban fracking in New York State. But as New York now transports fracked gas from Pennsylvania, the struggle goes on. The campaign to divest New York City pension funds from fossil fuel corporations also won. But we now need to ensure that the freed up pension funds be invested in environmentally sustainable alternatives. Moreover, that any loss of jobs be compensated by living wage jobs. Eco-socialists need to push all our options, while supporting all struggles around concrete environmental issues. We have to press the philosophical idea that the earth belongs to all of us, or better yet, that it belongs to no one. We are merely its beneficiaries and stewards for future generations. More important than specific wins, we should struggle to put these decisions under popular democratic control, thereby deepening democracy. Open political public discussions are essential, with mechanisms in place that allow people to indicate what they want, but along with institutions that enable them to have control, not just consultation, over the representatives that they choose to carry out the decisions. Participatory budgeting is an example of this, though very limited so far. Another good example, surprising because it comes from the US, is the public regulation of utilities. Though they're private, their profits and investments are capped. They're forced to subsidize the poor and to fund environmental projects. Every aspect of their work is open to the public. More people should know about this and think about how to replicate it. Critics would say that it's utopian to imagine that every cook can govern. But consider the near catastrophe at 3 Mile Island. The nuclear disasters were built and operated by private corporations without adequate information or any control by the people affected. In interviews with people in the community after the near meltdown, one woman said that if they just explained the possible consequences of relying on nuclear reactors, she would have preferred to hang her clothes out on the line. Explaining the implications of different options is the role of experts. Ordinary people can then evaluate these options according to their values and decide what to do. If the community's values had been in place, there would not have come to near disaster in 3 Mile Island. For an exciting experiment along these lines, see the article on Barcelona in this Socialist Register about a new kind of party that came out of social movements fighting the economic crisis. It, quote, crowdsourced its code of ethics and uses new digital technological means of developing democratic experiments at the local and regional level, quote. Of course, they're still operating within a capitalist system that limits what they can do, but they give us ideas for bottom-up, creative, democratic alternatives to capitalism. As Marx envisioned it, a post-capitalist society is one in which, quote, the associated producers rationally regulate their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control, and achieving this with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favorable to and worthy of their human nature. Beyond this lay the true realm of freedom, concluding with the shortening of the workday is its basic prerequisite, unquote. But this vision of a socialist society, where the means of production are owned in common and are democratically planned, is far from universal on the left today. Such a vision requires state institutions at various levels of society in addition to non-governmental institutions. And state institutions are necessary in the transition. Many people today are distrustful of the state for good reasons and focus instead on what they call horizontal movements and on non-governmental institutions. While, in my opinion, this reflects a healthy democratic impulse, and such movements and institutions are crucial to building a better world, this focus is insufficient. We need governments under democratic control to effect the massive regulation we need to control producers who are destroying the environment. Putting demands on existing governments is an important way to build and unify a movement of diverse groups, workers, farmers, environmental groups, and consumers, all of whom would benefit from sustainable industries. And under capitalism, who but the government can provide jobs or income to workers who will be displaced when destructive industries are shut down? Consider the workers and their labor unions that support the building of gas pipelines because they want the jobs. Many of the proposed pipelines go very close to rivers and are highly likely to pollute the water and the land, as well as increasing global warming. Obviously, this is highly irrational from a social point of view, but the workers are caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Within capitalism, it is just very difficult for individuals to carry out rational life and plans. Even corporations face structural constraints from the market system. In the 1990s, the CEO of British Petroleum adopted the slogan, "Beyond Petroleum," and they invested in solar energy. But 99% of their investments remain in petroleum, and that percentage is increasing. So the decisions impacting us all must be taken out of the hands of corporations. Others on the left today focus on democratic ownership and control at the level of enterprises, but within a market system. This seems attractive, but it has serious limitations. Some markets could exist in a society in which the crucial questions are decided democratically. However, the crucial question regarding markets is the relative power of the market within the society in which the enterprises exist. This is true both when worker-owned enterprises are put forward as a model of socialism, and even more so when we're talking of cooperatives within capitalism, but as leading to socialism, as a principal strategy to get to socialism. The largest and most successful cooperative in the world is Mondragon, often put forward as a model for socialists and a key strategic element in the struggle for socialism. A closer look, however, should give us pause. I don't have time to discuss this, but there's an excellent article in this Socialist Register. Most importantly, even if we're talking about worker-owned enterprises in a post-capitalist socialist world, society, as long as socialism is conceived as basically a market system, then it cannot resolve the multiple ecological crises we're facing. Worker-owned enterprises are constrained by the same political and economic forces of the market to continue to producing the same stuff in the same way. Even many prominent environmental thinkers, Bill McKibben, for example, seem to accept the logic of capitalist reproduction. They call for reliance on renewable energy rather than fossil fuels, but fail to mention that we need also to reduce growth. Even if we switch to cleaner, greener cars, if we continue to produce ever more cars, the resources and materials for building, maintaining, and transporting them would cause more pollution than we have at present. We need to contain our production and consumption within the limits of our finite planet, which means stepping outside the competitive market system. Thus, whatever markets there are in socialism have to be brought under the control of institutions of rational democratic planning. Not quite the last. Sorry. At what level should the planning be done? That all depends. A focus on the local is very important. I always buy local when I can. The t-shirt says buy local. And there are many inspiring examples of economic planning on the local level, like the participatory budgeting I've mentioned, and extended, and the agricultural, agroecological practices of La Via Campesina. Many experts, for example, Elinor Ostrom, stress the importance of keeping the planning small scale because local knowledge is bound to be more reliable than faraway experts' opinions, and people can develop trust and abide voluntarily by rules that they themselves develop to protect natural resources. Due to lack of knowledge and cooperation, regulation by central governments has often led not to conservation, but to destruction of natural resources. This advice on the importance of the local is very important to keep in mind. However, we must also recognize that many things simply cannot be accomplished in towns or cities or regions or even countries. We need national clean air regulations, or else states will compete for business by lowering environmental standards. And the same is true on an international level. Marx said in the German ideology that socialism in one country was impossible. How much clearer that should be today. Climate problems do not respect national borders. The whole planet shares the air. particularly bad air pollution in California a few years ago was traced to Asia. Deforestation in Latin America affects our air in North America and contributes to melting the polar ice caps. Dirty water in China leads to contaminated soil that leads to contaminated food, which is then exported around the world. This is why climate scientists call for planet-wide curves on emissions, and ocean scientists say we need a 5-year plan to save the oceans plundered by overfishing. Nor do the human and social problems engendered by climate problems stay within national borders. Consider unemployment due to depleted resources on land and sea, wars over scarce resources, and the millions of refugees fleeing across the globe as a result. Parenthetically, many of these social catastrophes particularly victimize women. Thus, to conclude, socialism would need more institutions of international governance, that is, planning and regulation, such as the United Nations of Socialist Societies, in addition to local, regional, and national institutions. The issue is not primarily whether planning is local, regional, national, or even international, I contend, but what kind of institutions enable rational, democratic control from below and adequately address our environmental crisis. We need a global network of these grassroots institutions, and our urgent task is to figure out what they would look like. Thank you.
Okay. We'll now turn to Demirovic, who has a wonderful essay, I think one of the best critiques of different aspects of radical democracy that exists in the English language. I've heard he's developed it much more, or is developing much more in German, speaking to speaking to radical democracy and socialism. Alex?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you, Craig and Leo, for inviting me to contribute to the issue of socialist register on democracy. Yeah, as others said this morning, it's an honor to contribute to this issue. And thanks for the compliments. Maybe it's too much a promise. Yeah, what I will here sketch out in a few minutes, because you see my English is not so good to do that. In
Try to
full
speak
length.
louder.
Yeah, in full length. Yeah. And okay, so I can just take up the arguments of Nancy, because I start with a very similar point we discussed after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, in the context of Attack Germany, and also in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the concept of multiple crises, because it's not only what you focused in particular on, the problem of environmental crisis, yeah, in all the different aspects. It's of course the financial crisis. It's a crisis in education, in family organization. Harriet yesterday here in this room explained a lot on the development of families and how destructive the current development is, and so on and so on. So I visited by accident here the museum, the New York City Museum, and I found it interesting to see that we are in a vicious circle of problems since 150 years. So it's capitalism. It's always going forth and back. The struggles about rent and rent control, yeah, having apartments or not, being well educated, fighting racism, fighting sexism, the control over the body, and so on. And so the photos, the text explain very well what's going on here in New York for decades and decades. And I found it very difficult to say that there may be some progress or not, but it's a kind of we are trapped in this circle of problems. It's like a loop, you know, and things becoming maybe worse. Maybe there is some progress with regard to emancipation of our everyday life, with regard to women's participation in politics and education, but there is also a kind of an increase of destruction. There is still an ongoing racism. You know, you mentioned the problem of refugees and so on. So my perspective on this is that the bourgeois leader, as Paul J. yesterday in the plenary explained to us in his speech, and I think he's right, they are discussing these problems. When you follow the debates on the World Economic Forum taking place every year in January in Switzerland, in Davos, you know, you get a clear sense that the bourgeois leader coming from the whole world, they discussing the problems in many aspects. Crisis of democracy, environmental crisis, the problem of currencies and so on and so on. But it is very clear that they are not able to solve the problems. They maybe, some of them have the will to do it, but they are not able. They just also repeat the problems. So far as I follow these debates in the newspapers, my impression is that they just are surprised for themselves to being confronted constantly with the same issues and problems again and again. What we experience now is authoritarian populism. Since some years, you know better than me how it is in the US and what Trump does, or is doing, with regard to knowledge, truth, objectivity, reason, and the commitments to these stances. I mean, Katz yesterday mentioned this. Truth is really endangered. The relation to objectivity. Can we say the truth about what's going on? The problem, do we have the right news? Are we informed about the developments, and what are the governments do to hinder us to get all the information we need, to change or to intervene in the social processes? Part of this is also the crisis of democracy itself, the democratic institutions we have to deal with. I see the representative democracy established in the period since World War I. So as a political, and I underline this, as a political form, so I refer here to Marx, what is important, and I see it in the tradition of Mead, George Herbert Mead, as an institutionalized permanent revolution. That fits very well to Marx's idea in the Communist Manifesto that the capitalist bourgeois society is a self-revolutionizing organism, and I see the political form of democracy as part of this process of a permanent revolution, organizing the compromises between social classes and other forces. As you mentioned, Aristotle, compromise between the rich and the poor, the owners of the means of production and the wage laborer, and to organize this compromise. At the same time, this compromise that enables to rule, to dominate the popular classes, doesn't allow the people in the political form to govern the society. So it's really a restricted realm that give not the possibility to steer the society, to solve the problems, as those people in the bureaucracy or in the ruling class know. Even if they want to do it, what would be a contradiction to their conditions of life, even if they would do it, they couldn't in using these institutions. So what I do in the article, and this is what I want to sketch out in a few minutes, is what I do is I examine what the theory of radical democracy offers to us, to maybe to go a step further, because for us in the left, Marxist debates, of course, it's important to see what radical democracy is about. Is it a mean to solve those problems we already spoke about? Yeah, and are these theories helpful for us? Because when you see the flyers here distributed on this conference, you see very often the reference to some ideas of radical democracy, of grassroots movements, and so on and so on. And then the problem is, what are the arguments, the theoretical basis, the foundations for these kinds of radical democracy? The idea of radical democracy, so far as I understand it, claims to contribute to a renewal of democracy, to strengthen democratic institutions by supporting these institutions through grassroots activities, groups, social movements, to give new impulses to the parties, to the bureaucratic organizations, like Jane Sanders, yeah, put that as a point, you know, the impulse of social movement activities could help the Democratic Party to get a new idea of its task, you know. So I'm very critical about this issue, because that means, in a way, to see social movements and grassroots activities as a function for established parties, not something that establishes and creates a democratic organization of social life for its own. Radical democracy is criticizing Marxism and the tradition of Marxism because of his distance to politics, seeing it as a shadow theater, as Slavoj Žižek put it, or as a phenomenon of a superstructural phenomenon of the economy. So a shadow theater of deeper processes, and the critique, and what the criticism also includes, that Marxism then suggests the expectation that once capitalist property relations were overcome through revolution, the immediate consequence would be to the demise of class antagonism, the rational management of nature, the end of all forms of exploitation and domination as racism, sexism, and of the division of labor. Correspondingly, there would be no longer be any political conflict. So the expectation that is criticized is the idea that at the final stage of the development there would be an harmonic and transparent society. In my eyes, that means socialist perspectives and radical democracy don't go easily together. That means it's not at all clear in which way radical democracy is to reconcile with the idea of socialism. Many of those who do work or theoretical work in this field of radical democracy are very critical about socialism, and more so critical about Marxism. What I suggest in the tradition of radical democracy, the experience of we have since the late 60s, I suggest to differentiate two types of radical democracy. I don't want to go into the details of this because that would take too much time. The first, I refer here to Jürgen Habermas, who is, in my eyes, one of the most important theorists doing this kind of theoretical work, and he understands politics as a subsystem, a functional subsystem with the function to produce binding decisions. These decisions are often unjust in relation to the life world of individuals. That's his criticism of our political institutions as far as we already have them. And his idea is to establish or to argue for the public sphere and just to produce always kind of public criticisms of already made decisions. Democracy allows a revision of already made decisions and procedures itself and claims for participation in public communications. So it's an idea of more and more inclusion of up to then excluded people. So at the end of the democratic process, all of the people should be part of the democratic will formation. Yeah. The radical democracy refers to moral norms of equality and freedom that are inscribed in the ability of individuals to speak with each other and to recognize the other speakers as equal and free. That is an important point to give a legitimation to the idea of democracy. In this part, not to refer to an abstract idea of the citizen, but to refer to individuals speaking with each other. Here the aim is to include, as I already said, more and more people into the democratic will formation process. Critical is this approach with regard to socialism, because Habermas criticizes that socialism contains the notion that society as a whole creates itself through politics. So it's in his eyes, socialism is a totalizing concept, and he claims that democracy should be limited to the public political arena. And this is, in my eyes, one of the important aspects of the theory, because it excludes, even in radical democracy, the idea of intervening and having democratic processes in the field of economy. So what I'm arguing here is, with reference to Marx in the Jewish question, that based on Marx's argument, we should also include the idea that the articulation of the social whole should be democratized in a way that we can reorganize the way how the articulation itself is construed. Yeah, so the separation of politics and economy in that regard is not any longer accepted, and different ways of articulation are part of our debate, of our democratic debates. So for conclusion, or to mention one argument to make it short, I think what is interesting in the second approach of radical theory is it's similar to the idea of Habermas' radical democratic theory, is that the process of democratic engagement never stops. It never comes to an end, or never will solve social problems, because the idea is that democratic participation always again will exclude people in a new way. So you always have people are concerned by new forms of exclusion and disadvantage, and that for that reason the idea is that democratic practice never will come to an end. So this is a kind of criticism of the left tradition, what means the criticism is to say that many of the left tradition leads in a way to a kind of totalitarianism and Stalinism, because the idea is at the end there will be no political conflict, no political antagonism, no political debate. Yeah. In my eyes, the problem is not a general idea of what a contradiction is, but to have a clear idea that contradictions are socially organized and socially formed. And so I would say that, of course, it is possible to reorganize the articulation of the social whole and to reorganize the processes of production, the relation to nature, and to overcome certain historical specific contradictions as racism and sexism. Thank you for listening.
We turn now to Leo Panitch, speaking from his essay that was in the last year's volume on the Rethinking Revolution and his new book, The Socialist Challenge Today.
Thanks, Greg. Plato famously called democracy a regime of ignoramuses. And I can't help but thinking, standing in the United States at this moment, that that was a pretty bloody good definition. And I think that really issues a challenge to us. Aristotle, who was hardly an advocate of democracy, nevertheless took the view that in certain instances, in certain places, collective deliberation by the unproperty, by the indigent artisans, could in fact produce political wisdom. And the liberal proponents of democracy in the 19th century, those who went beyond the utilitarian, and who were like Aristotle, not advocates of immediately opening up the franchise to the working man, let alone women, took the view that the actual practice of democracy would allow for the development of capacities on the part of those who had no experience in governing even their own households, to in fact be able to engage in collective deliberation and decision-making at the level of the state. This was, of course, C.B. Macpherson's great argument about John Stuart Mill. And his challenge to Mill was that in order to realize this, you liberals would have to become socialists. There is fairly wide agreement amongst political scientists and social historians that the modern democracies that we have, the capitalist democracies that we have, became democracies by virtue of the development of the modern labor movement in almost every instance. That it was the emergence of, for the first time in history, working class organizations, the organizations of subordinate classes, which were permanent organizations for the first time in history. There had always been slave revolts, etc. There had always been bread riots, usually led by women. But permanent organizations of the subordinate classes, the unions and the mass socialist parties, were crucial to the development of democracy as we know it. And democracy as we know it largely involves freedom of association, in which trade unionism was absolutely central, and the admission to the franchise, the right to engage in the selection of political representatives at the level of the state, to those who were on property, or to those who were even considered other people's property. In this country, black people, and more generally, of course, women around the world. The type of democracy we won then, and it was largely won by the struggles initially of these working class parties, those established between 1880 and 1920 in particular, coming first in New Zealand and Australia, and eventually elsewhere, many places even in the advanced capitalist European world, not coming until after 1945. That was a victory of the development of working class organization. By the 1960s, it was already evident that those working class organizations, which were, as Marx put it, oriented to developing the proletariat into a class, oriented to developing the capacities of those who had been robbed of decision-making capacity. That's what the division of labor was all about. That those parties were no longer developing the capacities of the class. This was already identified by Roberto Michels in his famous book, Political Parties, The Iron Law of Oligarchy, looking at the German Social Democratic Party, a student of Weber, who ended up being a supporter of Mussolini, but who pointed out that the German Social Democratic Party, which had precisely been engaged in this process, had for already decades no longer been putting much emphasis on this. Indeed, that those very working class people who had become representatives, whether trade union bureaucrats or parliamentary representatives, didn't want to develop the capacities of party members because they thought that they might throw them out and replace them with somebody else. And were controlling the party bureaucracy in order to prevent this, was Michel's argument. And he then argued, perhaps a mass education system will play this role. He wasn't saying it was inevitable that we would have oligarchy. He was hoping that a mass education would play this role in a way that a working class party did. And then, of course, with the Russian Revolution, as Rosa Luxemburg, let's take her name in this, immediately pointed out to Lenin by 1918, when elections and competing political parties were banned, she made the very basic point that John Stuart Mill had made. Without freedom of speech, without freedom of association, this doesn't matter to the bourgeoisie because they aren't interested in the development of the subordinate class's capacities. It especially matters to socialists, but because without those things, without an open public life, those capacities can't be developed. So, for those of us who became socialists in the 1960s, we became socialists despite the example of the Soviet Union. As an older worker said to me in San Gindan in 1990 in Togliatti, where the Russian car industry is located. He said that when we talked to him, Gorbachev was still in power, teetering on the brink. And he said to us, you know, since 1924 we've been made into fools. He didn't mean we had been fooled. He actually meant they had been turned into political fools. That is, that their political capacities had not been developed. And it was obviously the case that social democracy everywhere was not doing that. Social democracy had accepted a definition of democracy which was limited to, yes, people who are not developed in their capacities should have the ability to participate in selecting career political representatives. People who by profession are career representatives. The effects of this were a massive alienation on the part of intellectuals by the 1980s from the socialist project. on the grounds that those parties, though that working class attempt, not only had yielded totalitarianism, et cetera, but by focusing on the development of the capacities of the class, the organization of the class in the broadest sense, had neglected the organization of and the development of the capacity of people in their other dimensions. And most famously, this was the case made by Radical Democracy II in Demirovic's essay. Luxemburg's very famous book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. A book that I think has done enormous damage to the socialist cause. Now, typical of philosophers, which is what they are, they think that historical development is caused by the ideas in philosophers' heads. So in order to explain why the working classes had not developed broadly, so that far from representing a narrowly conceived industrial proletariat, they represented the masses in the broadest sense of their course, of their multiple diversities, right? In gender terms, in sexual terms, in racial terms, et cetera, et cetera. Insofar as that happened, you had to find it in the shitty ideas of Marx or even Gramsci. And they, of course, would read the pages in Marx or Gramsci or whoever that would prove that they had a narrow, non-developmental conception of the proletariat. That wasn't the reason. The reason was that these organizations, for highly pragmatic reasons, organized in ways that developed the class in a very narrow and constrained way. It was easier to organize German miners without attempting to transform their familial relations and take on the gender question. Insofar as they didn't try to define teachers as part of the working class, it was because it was so difficult at a time when teachers were Beamte, right, to be able to bring them into that process. And there were always limited historical, practical reasons why those choices were made. They were not made by reading the German ideology, which, as Terrell Carver has pointed out, is a concocted book in any case. What happened in the 1970s, and this is what this little book is about, is that in a number of communist and social democratic parties, and in the Democratic Party in the United States, the development of the new left, which became left despite the example of the Soviet Union, tried to reintroduce this notion of developmental democracy inside communist parties, inside social democratic parties, inside the American Democratic Party. They all failed. A lot of them were policy-oriented. We need more radical policy. But some of them were oriented to democratizing the party in order to be able to play that role again. Getting beyond the conception of the Communist Party official, but above all getting beyond the conception of the politician as the career representative. This went furthest, and this is why perhaps Corbyn is at the moment the one shining light we've got under that. This went furthest in the British Labour Party, where of all the attempts to change those parties, the one attempt that went furthest, that lasted longest, that mobilized most people happened to be in that most tepid of social democratic parties, the British Labour Party. And ironically, Alex, it was liberal, radical, and socialist all at once. If you took the person who represented it, it was Tony Benn, who began as a liberal radical, right? And as he said through this process of trying to change the party, I become a Marxist more and more as I try to do this. The theme was, the central theme of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy that got associated with Ben's name, was that unless you transform the Labour Party, you can't democratize the British state. Understanding, especially Britain, given the retention of the monarchy and the way in which that whole old symbolic apparatus still governs the formal procedures of British democracy, all of whom are always advising the monarch, even of course if they're making the effective decisions that still put that. The central theme is that without democratizing the party, turning it into an agency of political development, of the capacities of people who are political ignoramuses, precisely because of the division of labor, even if they have PhDs in physics in most cases. I don't know anything about politics, most scientists will tell you. Even those who are pointing to the climate crisis will often say, I don't know anything about politics, about how to do that. So Ben began to define the role of the political representative as that of an educator. Not dissimilar from the role that the Communist parties traditionally, in the Marxist tradition, assigned to the role of the cadre. Organizer as a developer of capacities, of collective capacities. After a decade-long struggle that failed, with the aid of cynics, I think, not only on the center right of the Labour Party, who couldn't imagine what Ben was talking about. It was all populist crap. After all, you need to go to Oxbridge in order to be able to make wise political decisions, study classics, etc. Or from the liberal media, let alone the right-wing media, which couldn't imagine this, led by The Guardian. They used to feature Eric Hobsbawm at every Labour Party conference, writing articles against the new left ideas of Ben, arguing that if we are going to be able to stop Thatcherism, we have to, in a popular front way, unite everybody to the left of Thatcher, and not engage in this transformative project, which was an illusion. It was defeated, it went away, the miners' strike put the final nail in the coffin, it was all over. I wrote a number of books saying, endorsing Ralph Miliband's view that the greatest illusion of British socialists was that the Labour Party could be turned into a socialist party. Lo and behold, the last few years, a person who was mentored by Ben, a group of people around him who came to political maturity through the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, through the example of the Lucas Aerospace shop stewards that Hillary, who's here, so often writes about, who were attempting to engage in a process of industrial conversion precisely through developing working class capacities to shift from the production of defense equipment to the production of kidney machines, etc. These people, who were totally marginalized inside the Labour Party, by a fluke, ended up in the leadership of the Labour Party. The fluke was that the unions remained important elements in the Labour Party. The Blairites couldn't get rid of them. They still were financially dependent on them for votes, etc. A number of left-wing leaders got elected, a new generation of left leaders had gotten elected during the Blairite years. The emergence of the anti-globalization and anti-war protest movements coincided with that. A media-savvy, a social media-savvy group of young people developed in that context. And suddenly there was an alliance that developed between those social media protesters, this left union leadership, and this entirely marginalized group of Benite Labour Party MPs who were in the Socialist campaign group of the Labour Party, which is what was Ben's group back 30, 40 years ago. It was even more a fluke because in order to stop the trade union influence after the delegitimation of Blairism in the Third Way, Ed Miliband, who was elected by the trade union vote, in order to show he wasn't beholden to the unions, introduced what the center-right and the Guardian had always said had to finally happen in the Labour Party, which is that they should adopt the American Democratic Party's example of primary and allow one member, one vote in the selection of candidates. The assumption there was, well, they all read the Guardian. They aren't activists, but they read the newspaper. Therefore, when they vote, they'll vote the way the Guardian tells them to vote. But they didn't. And lo and behold, they elected, not only elected Jeremy Corbyn, they joined the Labour Party by the hundreds of thousands. So we're now in a situation where someone like Corbyn, they don't all share this view, who do have, I think, a conception of democracy as that of the development of people's capacity, are actually leading the Labour Party. How far will they get? Well, in this little book, we I think, take a sober view of it, a very sober view of it, arguing that what Syriza shows us, and what I think the Corbynites by no means have discovered, is in what way can you engage in a process of state transformation of a kind that develops the capacities of people to make decisions in a non-Weberian, non-bureaucratic, non-technocratic, non-parliamentarist way. Hillary now, of all people, having written a critique of the Labour Party, has inevitably split between radicals of this kind and parliamentarians of the old kind, has suddenly joined the Labour Party. As a member of Momentum, is engaged in her area of London with Momentum in organizing in the community around issues like the housing crisis, in trying to make the party a center of working class life and capacity development. But at the same time, and I think Nancy was raising this very courageously, it isn't just a matter of trying to decentralize and devolve decisions down to local levels, down to the co-op level, down to the levels of the Lucas Aerospace workers, to take Hillary's example, industrial democracy. It is a matter of how to figure out how to do democratic economic planning at every level. At every level. And we don't know how to do this. We don't have a clue. We seriously don't have a clue. Harris's friend, Aristide Baltaz, a lifelong Marxist philosopher, became Minister of Education in the Syriza government. Once a week, he would go to a school, would simply phone up the principal, or have the phone up the minister is coming today. And he would meet with teachers and students and parents, if they could get there, and say, I would like this school to become a center of working class life, a center of radical political development. And then he walked away. The resources of the Ministry of Education were put to that purpose. If he had asked his civil servants to engage in that process, they would have said, what are you talking about? This is not what we do in the Ministry of Education. And the challenge for us, therefore, is not only to put confidence in the possibility that people can in fact act in ways democratically so as not to produce regimes of ignoramuses, but that they can also learn how to democratize complex administrations. That's the challenge before us, especially given the eco-socialist agenda that was laid out so well today. Thanks.
So I think all three speakers threw out lots and lots of challenges. You should challenge them back. They covered the terrain of of thinking about the democratic practices related to eco-socialism through the philosophical terrain of radical democracy through current political practices of developmental democracy. So there's a huge set of issues related to rethinking democracy out there. So let's throw it open to questions, challenges, rebuttals, and whatever else you put forward. Yep.
I'd just like to take off from this last point about planning, that we don't know anything about planning. But we have to plan an economy, that's true. But the Soviets tried to plan an economy. But many people on the left, even on the left, reject the idea of planning it's too big, we can't do it, and so forth. But I was just impressed a few years ago at the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. And what the student radicals, the students there did who were opposed to the proposition that the Chinese Communist Party should determine what candidates run for office there, they immediately organized a computer poll of the population of Hong Kong. They invited people to vote on this. And it was incredibly successful and a huge threat to the Communist Party because they got I don't know how many people, but millions of people out to vote on this. Of course, it was completely a straw poll. They had no power. But nonetheless, it was frightening to the Communist Party to have instant democracy like that. They put forward something, questions like that. And so that, I think, is what we need to talk about in democracy and planning, is that we need the population. We need to, like Nancy was saying about those people in Pennsylvania and the nuclear plant. We need to vote the big questions. We don't have to be technical experts about everything. We can hire technical experts. Corporations hire technical. Boards of directors don't know anything about what they're doing half the time. Mostly they're just, important people or something. They're shareholders or politicos. But they hire experts and they present them with plans and then they vote on it. And that's how the aggregate of all those corporations is how our economy gets shaped. Well, I don't see why we can't do that just as well, even better.
Go ahead.
In talking about basically educating people and getting them involved, imagine you want to get them involved in democracy, but we're all participating in literally thousands of systems at one time, right? So we can't be involved democratically in every system in our life. So how do we get people involved in specific systems and then basically assume that other systems are going to be run in a democratic, egalitarian way?
That's a tough.
This is my first time attending the left forum.
A little louder.
Can't hear you.
This is my first time attending the left forum. What I've noticed is that in most of the sessions I've attended, a small group of people speaks for a long time. People ask questions to the experts. And it's very interesting to listen to people who are so knowledgeable, so thoughtful on these topics. But I wonder if I could ask everyone in the room, how can we make the left forum these sessions more democratic, where everyone has more chance to speak and contribute their ideas, so that it's a little bit less like a lecture? I go to university and it's just like this. I sit and I listen to the professor at work and I listen to the boss. Go to church and listen to the priest, but it should be different, right?
So lots of challenges for everybody to speak up now.
I'd like to actually respond to that. I think that's one of the frustrations that I have with the left these days, is that there's such a fear of the state and socialism that they've reduced themselves to this kind of hyper-localist kind of democracy where it's like, they celebrate anarchists fixing potholes in Portland, Oregon now, instead of struggling for, the public money and the government that can do so much. I mean, even on a local level, but I mean, especially, I was at an earlier talk today with the modern money people. I mean, the potential that we have with the federal government when we have, control of our own currency, for full employment, for addressing climate change, so many huge things that we could never address on that kind of hyper-local kind of level.
We just had a record here of potholes in Toronto, and I smashed up my bike front wheel the other day, so I want some of those people from Portland to come over and just start patching. Others? Yeah, go ahead.
First, thank you for this amazing topic, great panel. I was wondering how we can conciliate democracy with a large political struggle against capital. There seems to be a tension between the rupture with the capitalist mode of production and the maintaining of democracy, which has taught us anything. So, how do we deal with adversaries in capitalist civilization in a democratic manner? Even if there is going to be part of the population that doesn't agree with whatever we will be putting forward government or not. And how do we, what's the difference between organizing once we're in power and when we are not in power anymore, if we accept representative democracy as a principle in visual to some extent, it also involves that we won't be in power all the time. Like Corbyn's going to be there for 4-8 years, and then eventually, there's going to be appointed there. So how do we ensure some continued stability or socialist transition?
These questions are kind of riffing off each other, so we can probably hold off responses yet. Go ahead.
Oh, I just, if anyone wanted to address it, I think, one thing that comes to my mind, talking about democracy in a nation-state context, is the constraints that are currently in place through the liberalized financial markets. And I also think the issue of what happened in Greece and the EU in the European context needs to be really thought through in terms of the constraints on the democratic project that the EU has imposed on, national governments. And that seems fundamental to thinking about democracy in a real political sense.
The institutionalized forms of actually existing liberal democracy.
Well, no, but the constraints of the EU and
Yeah.
more broadly of the liberalization
Yeah.
of finance.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey, Leo, I'm wondering if you could expound a little bit on the damage that you believe Chantal and Mouffe have done to the left. I understood the point theoretically as you laid it out. At the same time, my understanding is that they're one of the principal intellectual reference of Podemos, which is among the more positive, optimistic sort of things that we have going on, and a party which is also engaged in some interesting experiments around democracy. So a genuine question about reconciling that theoretical point you made with the...
That's also directed towards Alex's.
Yeah.
It's the theme of Alex's essay, actually, is the analysis of kind of movement, Leclerc, and some of their context and implications. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to push back a little on Leo's point that so many became socialists in spite of the Soviet Union. If you look at the new left, like Colombia, a lot of the leadership came out of the old left, red diaper babies. So it was because of the Soviet Union, and then it became the critical of the Soviet Union. So it's a little more dialectical than the way you put it. On Nancy Holmstrom's, I think you're connecting this issue to the ecological crisis is invaluable. It's really important. I would just put a caveat that the discourse about the finite planet needs to be a little bit deeper, because you need to capture the issue of the quality of energy that's used. And for it, if we solarize the global economy, as I wrote in 2017.
On Rethinking Revolution, David's essay on solar communism.
Yeah. We can actually, I think, increase the physical throughput of the economy, actually increase it by industrial recycling and reducing mining a great deal. So, and this actually has, I think, very important implications to a growth of like clean energy in the global south, which is suffering severely from energy poverty and the capacity actually to mitigate climate change. So it's the quality of energy and the whole entropy issue that needs to, I think, I would suggest be looked at when we use this discourse of the finite planet and the limits. I think it's too coarse a basis to think through it. So
We'll have another essay just on this topic in the next year's volume from his final essay from Elmer Alpert, which he wrote with his partner Brigitte Moncombe, which is exactly on this debate. It's a really an amazing tour de force considering he was writing it while ill and amazingly on. Anybody else want to come in? Ethan?
Well, I think one of the problems about the left's reticence about democracy has to do with a basic question which is never really discussed, which is, can democracy defeat counter-revolution? We don't really believe it. And the reason we don't really believe it is because we know that democracy involves a certain amount of time to get everybody involved, to that in the course of developing people's capacities, there's meetings and there's scores, hundreds of considerations to take into consideration, you know, about people's involvement, about the context in which people come into the democratic process and so on. And in the meantime, our enemies are crushing us physically. This is what's going on to a certain extent whenever you see repression. This is what's going on to a certain extent right now, and to a certain extent the turn away from the participatory democratic spirit of the new left towards different forms of centralized cadre has a lot to do with the fact that people knew that they couldn't survive if their attention was completely concentrated on those kinds of open meetings where, you know, people struggle for consensus and so on. So we have to take that into consideration, or else, you know, we're just basically whistling on our way over the cliff.
Okay, to close whistling over the cliff, Ethan's new paper is right here from the Stiftung on mapping the resistance.
Right.
Yes.
Maybe I should have called it whistling over the cliff.
Maybe whistling over the cliff. You might have changed the title. The next one. Go ahead.
I actually come from this from another perspective, being a progressive lawyer, and I wonder where you think movements like the Poor People's Campaign and the fact that you have people like Reverend Barber taking the concepts that are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in terms of the economic rights to decent life and everything. How do you see him, his movements with respect to the theories of democracy that you're articulating?
So we're almost to return to the panel. One more. Arun?
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about the role of antagonism.
Just speak up a little bit.
I'd like to hear more about the role of antagonisms because I report on both left and right-wing social movements. And I think, you know, for the right, antagonisms always exist. It sees society as a war of all against all. And I think especially for the left, the postmodern left, there's always this desire to just do away with antagonisms. And LeCloud talks about it in on populism, that, you know, in terms of being post-Marxist, as not seeing that class is going to resolve all antagonisms, but at a fundamental level, I think that's what you always see from kind of the activist left, the idea that we can't have any antagonisms, but we have to recognize that we have to kind of embed those in our politics. And you know, just to be fair, Leo, you know, I get your point about the U.S. and the ignoramuses, but, you know, I think Toronto had his feet with Rob Ford.
We're about to do it at the Ontario.
We're heading in the same direction as always.
You were the vanguard on this.
We're always just lagged a bit behind. But our ignoramus meter is catching up quickly. We'll have to hear from Hillary on
Well, I'll just
giving one of the great
briefly-
modern theorists of the socialist democracy.
No, I'll just make a brief point. Speaking as a new member
And there's
of the
her new
Labour,
book.
speaking as a new member of the Labour Party, I won't actually speak about the Labour Party, but I will speak a bit about this question of building on Leo's points about developing capacities. And I don't know how much you talked much about Greece.
Not here.
No, well, the little book does very well, and it draws particularly on a very important analysis. We should have brought this book by Andreas Karitsis, who was a leading member of Socialism, along with Paris Galenis, was here, and will be back. And I just want to stress the importance of understanding different kinds of knowledge that underpinning this emphasis and this importance of developing workers and popular capacity is an understanding of knowledge as being a practical and experiential and tacit as well as scientific. Indeed, tacit knowledge is a key part of scientific knowledge. So it's kind of going away from a very narrowly positivistic understanding of science as simply the science that can be centralized and codified. So in a way, that points to a very important critique of traditional conceptions of planning, which precluded that tacit level, and in the Labour Party led to a conception of planning underpinning a very bureaucratic notion of nationalisation that was based on a conception that had complete contempt for the capacities of ordinary people. And that if we recognise the key aspect of tacit and practical knowledge in developing any kind of publicly efficient economy, then that points to the importance of forms of popular economics, social economics, that actually can be developed in resistance as well as in government. So it can be developed from below if the party, has got that will. And in a way, as now a member, I can see that really it doesn't. That sort of presumption that the key thing is to get the Labour Party into government, and then the political expertise of the political class and the civil servants will implement, what's good for the people. And in a way, the whole, as Ralph Williband and Leo have shown, the whole kind of muscles of the Labour Party are completely geared to electoral politics. And that's quite difficult to break even now. It's very, very institutionalized. So, the new momentum movement, which is, very, very impressive, but it's particularly impressive and particularly devoted to a new kind of electoral politics, winning votes through talking to people and through, actually having arguments and so on, rather than just sort of finding out who's going to vote Labour and then kind of making sure they get to the vote. But, when they go canvassing and talking to people, they don't also find out, okay, so what are you involved in? How are you struggling in your estate? How are you involved in developing new thinking? And then build that into a new kind of development of alternatives in the here and now. Though Corbyn, he's developed this initiative called the Community Wealth Building Commission. And that's specifically bringing together trade unionists, local authorities, cooperative activists, and others to develop and support initiatives now to develop an alternative economics, whether it's municipalities like a place called Preston, which has learned a lot from experiences here in Cleveland. And I think that the learning from experiences here is going to be important. I mean, listening to Phil Thompson from the New York municipality, there's a lot of initiatives being taken here using the limited powers of local authorities, but using them nonetheless to develop people's economic capacities. So I think it's important not to denigrate the significance of those local initiatives, as long as they're in the framework of a national strategy. And I think what was key about Greece, and this guy Andreas emphasizes, is that there was a whole kind of network of solidarity economics that for a certain point, Syriza did, support. But then came the possibility of getting into government. And instead of thinking, okay, how do we, in preparing for government, which we know isn't power, how do we develop this economic alternative, this material alternative, which could give our supporters and the people of Greece, working class people of Greece, the sort of economic resilience to sustain a prolonged struggle with the Troika. Instead of doing that, they shifted all the emphasis of the party entirely to an electoral strategy. And I think that that's the danger with Corbyn, in shifting to an electoral strategy, you also shift a bit to the centre because you've got to kind of square it with the Guardian, or you've got to kind of reach some sort of centrist voters because maybe you're not going to reach enough young people, dispossessed people. And so I think this issue of capacity building is key to any sort of economic strategy, which has got to, if there's going to be any chance of dealing with capital and the right-wing media and so on, that alternative economic strategy needs to be developed actually now, out of resistance to the privatising austerity measures of the Tories. And so that's the only thing I'd add to Leo's points. And also maybe one final point linked to that is that in thinking about how to democratise the party, I think it does require this change in mentality about knowledge and whose knowledge is important. And that's what's key about Corbyn. He says explicitly, knowledge lies in the streets. And he's thinking of, he described to us in an interview, this friend who was, kind of living an incredibly ecological life because of his knowledge of climate change and his, both a mixture of investigations and of practical experience, who was a street sweeper, but who had all that knowledge. And so, although Leo's right about, the way in which we have been made into fools, we've also got to recognise that human capacity to sort of find crevices of possibility. And so that there is that knowledge there, that the party, in a way, needs to turn on the head the idea that it's only when in office that real expertise can be exercised through the state, through centralised planning, but rather say, actually, this knowledge can now be not just a campaigning resource or a cultural resource, but a resource actually for an alternative economics, which is, I think, one of the lessons of the Greek. I just summarised Andreas' points about building a resilience amongst the people through collective economic initiatives that need coordination. So we can't sort of romanticise, the odd isolated co-op producing food. It's got to be part of a sort of coordinated process. That should be the point of a political party. Anyway.
Good. So we've had a few queries, a lot of dialogue, a few queries, a few challenges. So if you want to take a couple minutes each for final responses. Okay. We've finally got the heat on in here too, finally.
Can't feel it.
There is a little here. I'll start shuffling it forward.
I'll just focus on a couple of points in the order in which they was raised. First, about how to democratize the left forum. I should say that I was on the board for a number of years, and one of the things that led to a few of us resigning was that it led more and more to this kind of shape that it's in. Some ideas could be, probably not with the current leadership of the left forum, but that there would be some more sort of, talks, discussion, and some more workshop formats, some greater amount of time between panels, so that people would meet and greet and organize and things set up that way. Anyway, those are just two ideas, and I think people should think about it and let them know. But we were stopped. On the finite planet language, the point I made about the role of experts to tell us what's possible. So the experts need to tell us, and maybe you're one of them, what exactly are the limits? you know, they may be much broader than we believe if we could really actualize solar energy, and I believe that's probably so, but they're still finite. And whatever those limits are, we have to figure out how to equalize consumption and production for all of us on the planet. So you know, thank you for that. On the Poor People's Campaign, I mean, which connects very well to Hillary's point, I think. I think socialists, or at least speaking as a socialist, believe that liberal values, you know, that we should build on liberal values, not reject them. You know, socialize, interpret, broaden liberal values. So the Poor People's Campaign maybe, you know, appeals to the Universal Bill of Rights, but socialists shouldn't deny that Universal Bill of Rights. We should press for them and show the limits within capitalism. So I 100% endorse the Poor People's Campaign. I think it has the potential, like MLK, who was really a socialist, you know, and that was becoming more clear. I mean, you can see it in his writings from the early days, but it was becoming more clear by his economic campaigns at the end, when unfortunately, tragically, he was killed. And I think that fits very well with the points that Hillary was making about developing capacities and recognizing different kinds of knowledge which may not take an educated, formal shape, but learned on the ground. I'm sure Reverend Barber knows that, you know, and utilizes that, and we should, you know, acknowledge that and spread that. I think that's a point that has been made by Hillary and others in the socialist feminist movement, challenging the notion of what is knowledge and how it's gained, and how we want to develop the capacities of more people to, you know, so that every cook can be allowed to govern.
Alex?
Yeah.
Yes, we should clap.
The damage Chantal Mouffe made, yeah, I think I see 3 points that are important for me, yeah. The first one is that she ignores the role of how to influence or to intervene or to democratize economy, because she argues in this regard as a liberal, so she's not interested in that. And instead, she refers to kind of a sociology of modernization, you know, when she's critical about bureaucratization, consumerism, and so on. So she makes a step out of her own theoretical framework, but more or less she argues liberals. The second one is the, how to say, the left populism she's arguing for. I mean, I think what in my eyes is necessary to have a new class politics, you know, but my criticism is that she's not very honest with regard to the problems she herself and the policy she is supporting. When you think of Spain and France, she's a sympathizer of Mélenchon, and Mélenchon is, in my eyes, a construction of a populist party that works from above, top down. You know, he is selecting the members for the electoral campaign, and she's completely ignoring this aspect when she speaks about it. And the third one is what I really don't like in her theory, that when she refers to this relation of antagonism and agonism, she says we need, in difference to Rawls and Habermas, an idea of political dissent, yeah, and anger, but what for? Yeah, to cool it down to a kind of a moderate attitude in politics. And in my eyes, we need more aggressiveness, more anger, more engagement, more involvement, because we need how to say, what we have to do is to for us and for others to create a mood of, to do all these things that are necessary to come over the threshold of important decisions, you know. And she just want to keep everybody, yeah, smooth, yeah, as in, so, okay. So I just want to say something to the point of the temporal aspect. Of course, we are not, can be involved in anything. And we are today, and we shouldn't think of us as becoming a god, yeah, in political terms. But I think arguing for a kind of economic or democracy means to find more time for participating in the relevant decisions, common decisions that concern our everyday life. So in my eyes, part of economic democracy should also have in mind the idea of that participating in economic decision making is part of working time. You know, it's not separated from this. So it's really in itself a social activity and should be seen as such. Is there time for a third?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. No, we're not rushed because nobody's coming in, so you have a good one.
Yeah. Okay, I think what is really an interesting aspect, I'm not clear with this point, but this is really an interesting aspect. We discussed this in relation to the Russian Revolution, being in power. What does it mean? This was your question, isn't it? No, someone, yours. Yeah, so the problem of being in power and then for maybe 4 years or 8 years, and what does that mean? I mean, when you think of completely changing the social relations, I mean, this is, it has a deep impact of all aspects of our lives. And this is, and then of course the problem is that yeah, we need the time to involve people, to convince people, and then on the other side you have what you said, the enemies that can crush us. Yeah, and so I think, but for me, one of the aspects, what I think is important, that people don't trust us, right, as long as they can expect that we wouldn't give up the power we have. So they cannot make and not have any influence about the way how we going to use the power, you know, to concentrate, to appropriate only for us. And so the people are really in distrust for this, you know, and I think this is an important aspect that they have, that they can expect, that they can even then, yeah, influence the process, yeah. So, and I think what Foucault names as socialist governmentality, how can we limit ourselves in the way we use, yeah, and it's not only us as leaders, it means the whole of us, yeah. How do we use the power and the way, and how do we, when we have the insight that something is going wrong, do we press the people, do we force the people to go on, or do we organize a kind of a revision? And this is also an temporal aspect, what was really important in the Greece experience, yeah, of Syriza. To find the time when you are in the ministry, to be in cooperation with those people in the movements, you know. So you have to organize it, and this is really a difficult aspect of that what we want to do. Yeah. And I think we should think more about this. Then we should think about on this in democratic terms, also with regard to planning, because there is so much planning in our society. Walmart is planning more than the Soviet Union ever did, you know, but the problem is the democratic way to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm glad Alex took up the MOVE question. I would just add to it that I think the problem at one level was the bracketing of capitalism. in a book called Socialist Hegemony and Socialist Strategy and Hegemony, there are 3 paragraphs on the nature of capitalism. So that was bracketed, and I think that so much of the pluralist left politics that followed bracketed capitalism. Never said they were in favor of it, never said they were against it, but the relationship of their struggles to overcoming it was marginal. Secondly, related to that, and much more important, the project of transforming the class so that it was encompassing of the feminist struggle, the layers of racism that still existed in the class, etc. Rather than transforming the class, what Hillary and Sheila Rowbotham and Lynn Siegel called beyond the fragments, that is, taking socialist feminism and that struggle into the struggle to transform the working class. Right? That got moved to an articulation of particularities, right? In a popular frontist way, I think. And I think that really was an enormous problem. How does one begin to answer unanswerable questions because the left doesn't know these things? The opening question on too many meetings, too many specific knowledges, I think is the key question. And I think the greatest problem is that we don't address ourselves to figuring out how to overcome those problems in the process of trying to make change. So then the question about this format becomes very, very relevant. But I think we also need to be honest. I find it very frustrating as a teacher to pretend that people coming straight out of the high school, relying on their particular experiences, right, should be leading a discussion. And we shouldn't have lectures up at the front in an articulate and practiced and you know, difficult, developed way, also giving them an example. So it's a very difficult thing. This is a top-down process. How do you turn it in a way that does draw on the experiences of people, but nevertheless doesn't validate the limits of those experiences? And you know, this is what we need to try to figure out as we try to develop new political practices, new formats. We don't know these things, and the idea is really to discover what we don't know in a way in political organization. And I also think that applies to the tacit knowledges that Hillary is so right to point to. There's loads of stuff that isn't known on the part of people who do have a lot of tacit knowledge, and that needs to be developed. I think the question that finally deserves answering is the question about, you know, transnational financial capital power. And this, you know, is what the left refuses to confront when they condemn Syriza for betrayal, etc. By saving the banks, you reproduce the disciplinary power of the banks over governments. Exactly did that. And we can't pretend that's not there. You know, people who walk around with Plan B in their heads are either doing two things. They've either got a Bolshevik notion that Tsipras was Kerensky, and that Antarcia or the CP, who couldn't get 6% of the vote, Antarcia couldn't get 1%, would, in the face of the betrayal of Kerensky, right, be able to come to power, make a revolution, at what? You know, socialism in Greece by itself, like socialism in one country in the Soviet Union? I mean, they simply are not serious, it seems to me. In fact, they're technocrats, because they think all you need is a Plan B, the same Greek state, the same level of development of Greek working class capacities, but we've got Plan B, we'll just put it in. It's really disgusting, I think. And it's a reflection of the failure of the left that we get this kind of attitude. Now, of course, Syriza is being social democratized. And we're seeing that process going on. It's not taking up the challenge that Kouritsis was putting. That's true. But to say all they needed to do was snap their fingers and have Plan B is precisely, I think, the problem. So, you know, let's take the Labour Party case, and I don't know what's going to happen. They're going to introduce a national investment bank, and they'll introduce regional investment banks. McDonald says, in talking to the city financiers, they are saying to him, well, we recognize that the privatized utilities will have to be renationalized, and so long as you'll let us invest in them with a decent rate of return, we can live with that. And he's very strategically confident. And maybe he's right. But what that and those regional and national investment banks will provide an infrastructure for the kinds of projects that Hillary is talking about, at the municipal level, at the co-op level, etc. And that's crucial. I think what Rick Wolff usually leaves out in his talk about co-ops is that infrastructure. Is precisely that infrastructure for relating them to one another. Right? But that still leaves the City of London as the center of international finance, with all its disciplinary power over the government and over those regional investment banks. And they are facing an appalling dilemma. You know, they have no compunction about saying, we would like to turn the City of London into a public utility. They have no compunction, I'm talking privately, of course, about saying on the morrow we're elected, we must introduce capital control. Some of them will even say, unless we do that, we'll have no moral authority, because it's the exploitation of the people around the world that shows up in the surplus that passes through the City of London in the derivative market, in the bond market. And yet, if you introduce capital controls as soon as they're elected, there will be a massive run on the pound. You will multiply the austerity inevitably. You haven't prepared people for a change in their standard of living, right, which will be required by the ecological crisis additional. Right? This is the dilemma they're facing, and it raises that long-run question, that people were raising. How much time is needed? What preparation is needed in order to be able to do this? Of course, another financial crisis would help, ironically. But that itself is without the capacity to develop politically, it isn't going to take us very far. I really think this is a matter of asking the questions, not pretending that we know the answers. It's putting the objective of socialism back on the agenda and then saying we really don't know how to do it.
I know how to do it. I want to thank Albert and Stephanie for their period here in North America, helping their contribution to the North American left over the last, how many years has it been? 6 years. Thank you very much.